Snow fell upon the kingdom of Aldoria like a whispered secret, settling on the ancient stone walls of Ravensthorn Castle with the patience of centuries. Through the arched windows of the great hall, 1,000 candles burned in iron chandeliers, their light spilling across flagstone floors worn smooth by generations of noble feet. Outside, the winter of 1463 pressed against the fortress with bitter determination, while inside, the kingdom's most powerful families gathered for the most anticipated event of the season, the Midwinter Ball, hosted by King Edmund III to celebrate the return of his only son and heir from 5 years of diplomatic exile. Alara Thorne pressed her back against the cold stone of the servants' passage, her fingers still trembling from the needle that had pricked her thumb not an hour prior. A single drop of blood had fallen upon white silk, and that single drop had nearly cost her everything. She was 22 years old, employed as a seamstress in the household of Lady Marguerite Ashworth for the past 6 years, and she had learned in that time that invisibility was not merely expected of those in service. It was demanded with the same fervor that nobility demanded gold thread in their ceremonial robes. The tear in Lady Ashworth's gown had been discovered as the castle bells tolled the 7th hour. A seam along the bodice had surrendered to the strain of the lady's generous figure, and Alara had been summoned from the servants' quarters with urgency bordering on hysteria. She had sewn with fingers made steady by years of practice and the ever-present threat of dismissal, her stitches so fine they vanished into the velvet like morning mist into meadow grass. Now she stood in the narrow corridor behind the great hall, listening to the musicians tune their lutes and viols, to the murmur of voices that spoke of alliances and inheritances in which she would never share. Her gray wool dress marked her as staff, her linen cap as someone to be looked through rather than at, and she was grateful for both. In a world that celebrated visibility, the flash of jewels, the sweep of silk, the herald's announcement of titles at doorways, Alara had made a sanctuary of her own erasure. She was not beautiful in the way the court defined beauty. Her features were too angular, her eyes too watchful, her hands too roughened by years of honest labor. But there was something in her face that caught candlelight differently than others, a certain architecture of cheekbone and shadow that court painters might have called arresting, had anyone thought to paint a seamstress from the lower village. Her mother had been a healer, her father a blacksmith who died when she was 7, and she carried both inheritances in the copper hints of her hair and the quiet strength carved into her bearing. The great doors opened somewhere ahead, and sound rushed through the corridor like a river breaking its banks. Alara pressed herself flatter against the wall as 2 servants passed, carrying platters of roasted pheasant toward the celebration. They did not see her. No one ever saw her, and that was precisely as she intended. Her task now was simple. Remain available should any garment malfunction among the noble ladies, but otherwise stay hidden until the ball concluded and she could return to her small chamber beneath the eaves, where a single tallow candle and her mother's herb journal awaited. She had survived 6 winters in this castle by perfecting the art of presence without existence, and tonight would be no different. Or so she believed. The commotion began near the main entrance, a ripple of excitement that passed through the assembled guests like wind through wheat. Alara heard it before she understood it, the particular quality of whispers that signified someone important had arrived, someone whose importance exceeded even the considerable pride already in attendance. She knew about the prince, of course. All of Aldoria knew. Crown Prince Alaric had returned 3 weeks prior from the kingdom of Valdenhall, where he had spent 5 years serving as his father's diplomatic envoy, following a scandal that the court still refused to name aloud. He was 28 years old, unmarried despite numerous attempts by foreign courts to secure his hand, and the sole heir to a throne that traced its lineage back 400 years. Every ambitious mother with a marriageable daughter had been scheming since the announcement of the ball, and the great hall had become the battlefield for their collective aspirations. Alara had no interest in princes. She had no interest in balls or gowns or the elaborate theater of power that unfolded nightly in castles like this one. Her interests were simpler and more urgent. Bread, shelter, coins saved for her younger brother Thomas, who dreamed of becoming a scholar despite their low-born status. Every stitch Alara sewed was a stone in the foundation of a future that had nothing to do with chandeliers or crowns. But fate, as it often does, had different intentions. The accident occurred at precisely the 9th hour. Alara would remember the time because the castle bells had just finished their count when Lady Ashworth's daughter, the perpetually dramatic Lady Cecily, came rushing through the service door that should have remained bolted. Lady Cecily was 18, beautiful in the delicate way of spring blossoms, and thoroughly overwhelmed by her first midwinter ball. She had been fleeing something, or someone, and in her haste, she collided with Alara with enough force to send them both sprawling across the cold stone floor. The chaos that followed happened too quickly for reason to intervene. Lady Cecily's gown caught on a torch bracket as she fell, tearing a gash from shoulder to waist that exposed her kirtle and a considerable length of her chemise beneath. She screamed, not from pain but from the particular horror of social exposure that afflicted young noblewomen trained to view their bodies as political currency. Within moments, servants appeared, then Lady Ashworth herself, her face cycling through expressions of alarm, fury, and calculation with impressive speed. "Cover her," Lady Ashworth hissed, her voice low and dangerous, "before anyone of consequence sees." But someone of consequence had already seen. The crowd that had gathered near the service passage included several guests who had wandered too close in search of the commotion's source. Among them, standing at the back with an expression of careful neutrality, was a man whose face had been described to Alara 100 times by the other servants, though she had never seen him herself. Crown Prince Alaric of Aldoria was tall, taller than she had imagined from the whispered descriptions, which had painted him as cold and formal and distant. In person, there was nothing cold about him. He moved with the measured grace of someone trained from birth to command attention, and yet there was something in his bearing that suggested he found his own position vaguely burdensome. His eyes were the color of deep winter, gray touched with blue, like ice over still water, and they were fixed not on the hysterical Lady Cecily, but on Alara. It was the briefest of glances, lasting perhaps 3 heartbeats, but in those heartbeats, something shifted in the quality of the air between them. Alara felt it like the change in pressure before a storm, like the moment between lightning and thunder when the world holds its breath. His gaze moved over her face with an intensity that felt almost physical, and then, impossibly, he inclined his head. A fraction of movement, barely perceptible, but unmistakable in its meaning. He had seen her. The Crown Prince of Aldoria, heir to one of the oldest thrones in all the northern kingdoms, had looked directly at a seamstress in a servant's passage and acknowledged her existence. Ilara's heart contracted with something between terror and wonder. She dropped her eyes immediately, her training reasserting itself with the force of survival instinct, and by the time she looked up again, the prince had turned away. Lady Ashworth was barking orders, Lady Cecily was being bundled off to a private chamber for repairs, and the crisis was passing like all crises eventually do. But something had changed. Something had torn, like Lady Cecily's gown, and Alara knew with the certainty of bone and blood that it could not be mended with any needle she possessed. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this one, stories of forbidden glances and impossible connections, are what we do best here. Subscribe now, so you never miss the moment when everything changes. Alaric had not intended to attend the ball. In truth, he had not intended to do much of anything since his return to Ravensthorn 3 weeks prior. 5 years in Valdenhall had taught him many things: diplomacy, patience, the art of smiling while his soul calcified into something unrecognizable. But it had not prepared him for the sensation of walking through the halls of his childhood home as a stranger. The tapestries were the same, the stone corridors unchanged, but he himself had been hollowed out and refilled with something harder, something that no longer fit the shape of the boy who had left. His father had summoned him back for reasons that remained opaque despite numerous conversations. The king spoke of succession, of duty, of the necessity of Alaric taking a bride before another winter passed. But beneath the formal words, Alaric sensed something else. Fear, perhaps, or desperation. King Edmund was 63 years old, his health declining with each passing moon, and the throne required an heir secure enough to weather the storms that would inevitably follow his death. Alaric understood the logic. He simply could not find it within himself to care. The scandal that had sent him into exile had involved a woman, or rather, the exposure of a relationship that should have remained in shadows. Lady Rowena Blackmore had been married, older than Alaric by 7 years, and positioned at the very heart of court politics through her husband's role as the king's chief advisor. Their affair had lasted 2 years before Lord Blackmore discovered them, and the consequences had rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Lady Rowena had been sent to a convent in the southern mountains. Lord Blackmore had died of a fever 6 months later, though rumors persisted that his heart had simply stopped from shame. And Alaric had been dispatched to Valdenhall with instructions not to return until his father summoned him, until the court had forgotten, until he had learned whatever lesson his disgrace was meant to teach. He had learned nothing except how to survive without feeling. The ball tonight was a performance, and he had been playing his part adequately. He had danced with the daughters of dukes and earls, had complimented gowns and jewels with the appropriate level of enthusiasm, had allowed ambitious mothers to parade their offerings before him like merchants displaying silks at market. He had smiled until his face ached and nodded until his neck stiffened, and through it all he had felt precisely nothing. Until the servants' corridor, until the girl with copper-touched hair and eyes the color of autumn forests. Alaric stood now at the edge of the great hall, a goblet of wine untouched in his hand, replaying the moment in his mind with obsessive precision. He had not meant to look at her. He had simply followed the commotion like everyone else, drawn by the sound of feminine distress and the possibility of entertainment in an evening desperately lacking in genuine interest. But when he had seen her, pressed against the stone wall, her gray dress rendering her nearly invisible, her face a study in controlled fear, something had shifted in his chest. Something had awakened that he had believed permanently dormant. She had been trying so hard to disappear. He had watched her shrink against the wall, had seen the way she angled her body to avoid taking up space, had recognized in her posture the desperate prayer of the powerless. Do not see me. Do not notice me. Let me remain in shadow where it is safe. And yet, her face had caught the torchlight in a way that made his breath catch. Not beautiful in the court sense. Nothing about her suggested hours spent before mirrors or consultations with dressmakers, but striking in a manner that felt almost dangerous. There was intelligence in those forest-colored eyes, and pain, and something else he could not name, but desperately wanted to understand. He had acknowledged her. A nod, barely perceptible, breaking every rule of station and protocol that governed interactions between royalty and servants. He did not know why he had done it. Perhaps because she had reminded him, in that moment, of what it felt like to be human, to be frightened and vulnerable, and struggling to survive in a world designed for the comfort of others. Your Highness appears distracted. Alaric turned to find Lord Chancellor Westbrook at his elbow, the elderly statesman's eyes sharp despite his advanced years. Westbrook had served the crown for 4 decades and missed nothing that transpired within the castle walls. Merely fatigued, Alaric replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he had perfected in Valdenhall. 5 years away from court festivities leaves one unprepared for their particular demands. Indeed, Westbrook's tone suggested he believed none of it. Your father is eager to discuss the matter of your betrothal. Several promising candidates have presented themselves this evening. I have noticed. Lady Eleanor of Westmarch seems particularly suitable. Her father controls the northern trade routes, and an alliance would strengthen our position considerably. Lady Eleanor has a laugh like a startled goose. Westbrook's expression did not change. A minor consideration when weighed against political advantage. For you, perhaps. I am the one who would have to hear it daily. The Chancellor studied him for a long moment. Your Highness must understand the necessity of this union. The King's health declines. The succession must be secured. Your previous indiscretion has left doubts in certain quarters about your judgment in matters of the heart. A strategic marriage would address those concerns while strengthening the realm. Alaric felt the familiar numbness settle over him like a shroud. I understand my duty, Lord Chancellor. I have understood it since I was old enough to comprehend what it meant to be born into chains of gold. Then you will choose a bride before the winter ends? I will consider my options. It was dismissal, and they both knew it. Westbrook bowed, the gesture precise and practiced, and retreated into the crowd. Alaric watched him go, then let his gaze drift back toward the servants' corridor, though the door had long since closed, and the seamstress with the autumn eyes had vanished into whatever shadows had claimed her. He should forget her. He knew this with the certainty of a man who had learned the cost of reaching beyond his station's expectations. Servants were invisible for reasons that had nothing to do with their worth and everything to do with the preservation of order. To notice one, truly notice one, was to introduce chaos into a system designed to prevent exactly that. But Alaric had spent 5 years learning to feel nothing, and now, against all wisdom, he found himself feeling something. He wanted to know her name. 3 days passed before Alara saw the prince again. She had returned to her work immediately after the incident with Lady Cecily, mending and hemming and embroidering as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and she felt the alteration in her bones like the ache that preceded a change in weather. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams she refused to examine too closely, and her fingers, usually so steady, trembled when she thought too long about gray-blue eyes and an impossible nod of acknowledgement. Her quarters were located in the servants' wing, a narrow room beneath the castle's eastern eaves that she shared with 2 other seamstresses. The space was cold in winter and stifling in summer, but it was safe, and Alara had learned long ago to value safety above comfort. Her mother's herb journal sat on the small shelf above her pallet, its pages filled with remedies and wisdom that Alara read each night before sleep, a ritual of connection to the woman who had died when Alara was 15. The castle operated on rhythms as old as its stones, and servants learned those rhythms or perished. Alara rose before dawn to begin her work, took her meals in the kitchen with the other staff, and retired after evening prayers to her small chamber. She spoke when spoken to, avoided eye contact with those above her station, and performed her duties with the quiet excellence that ensured continued employment. But the rhythm had been disrupted, and Alara could not find her footing. "You've been distant," observed Margaret, the older seamstress who occupied the pallet beside Alara's. Margaret had been at Ravensthorn for 30 years and possessed the disconcerting ability to notice everything. "Since the ball." "I've been tired." "You've been thinking." "There's a difference." Margaret set down her needle and studied Alara with the practiced eye of someone who had survived 3 decades of castle politics. "What happened in the corridor?" "The truth, not the version Lady Ashworth has been telling." Alara's hands stilled over her embroidery. "Nothing happened. Something always happens in corridors. That's why they exist, to connect one something to another. Lady Cecily tore her gown. I helped repair it, that's all." Margaret made a sound that suggested profound disbelief. "And the prince? The one everyone says was standing there when the commotion occurred?" Alara's heart performed an uncomfortable maneuver. "What about him?" "The Kitchens are talking. They say he looked at you. Really looked, not through you the way they usually do. The Kitchens are mistaken." "The Kitchens are never mistaken about princes. They've been watching this particular one since he was 7 years old and demanded an extra portion of honey cake. They noticed when he returned from Baldenhall changed, harder, emptier, like a house where the fire has gone out. And they noticed when, for the first time in 3 weeks, something in his eyes flickered back to life." Alara set down her needle with more force than intended. "I'm a seamstress, Margaret. Less than a seamstress. I'm the daughter of a blacksmith and a village healer, with nothing to my name but 10 years of calluses and the clothes I stand in. Crown princes do not look at women like me. They look through us, around us, past us toward the noble daughters their advisors have selected for consideration. Whatever the Kitchens think they saw wrong." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, "Your mother was a remarkable woman. Did you know I met her once before you came to the castle? She came to treat Lord Ashworth's hunting hound, the one that had caught its leg in a trap. The castle healer had given up, but your mother walked 7 miles through snow to save that animal. She had hands like yours, clever and steady, and eyes that saw things others missed." Alara felt her throat tighten. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because remarkable women are noticed, whether they wish to be or not." Margaret picked up her needle again. "Be careful, child. Princes are not fairy tales. They're chess pieces on boards we cannot see, and when they move, they sweep lesser pieces aside without thought or consequence." The warning settled into Alara's chest like a stone dropped in deep water. She knew Margaret was right. She knew that whatever had passed in that corridor, that impossible moment of recognition, meant nothing and could lead nowhere. She was a servant, bound by laws older than memory to invisibility and silence, and princes were creatures of another realm entirely. But knowing and feeling were different kingdoms, and Alara found herself a reluctant traveler between them. The summons came the following afternoon. Alara was in the sewing chamber, a converted storage room in the castle's lower levels, where natural light filtered through high windows to illuminate her work. She was repairing a ceremonial banner, a delicate task requiring precise stitching, when a page appeared in the doorway, his livery marking him as a member of the royal household rather than a servant of one of the lesser nobles. "Alara Thorne?" She set down her needle, heart hammering. "Yes? You are to come with me. You have been requested in the Solar." The Solar. The private sitting room reserved for the royal family and their closest advisors. Alara had never set foot in that part of the castle, had never expected to, and the summons felt like being told to present herself for execution while smiling graciously. "May I ask who has made this request?" The page's expression remained carefully neutral. "I am not at liberty to say. You are to bring your sewing implements." At least they wanted her for her skills. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. She gathered her basket, needles, threads, scissors, a selection of buttons and clasps, and followed the page through corridors that grew progressively grander as they moved toward the castle's heart. The stone walls gave way to tapestries depicting ancient battles and royal triumphs. The torches were replaced by candelabras of silver and brass. Servants grew scarcer, replaced by guards in ceremonial armor who watched her pass with expressions of calculated boredom. The solar door was oak bound with iron, and it opened before the page could knock. Queen Matilda stood in the center of the room, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have required hours to achieve. She was 58 years old, still beautiful in the way of winter landscapes, cold and severe and impossible to ignore. Behind her, seated in a chair by the fire, was Crown Prince Alaric. Alara dropped into the deepest curtsy her legs could manage, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Rise," said the queen. "Let me see your face." Alara obeyed, though every instinct screamed at her to remain invisible. The queen studied her with the appraising eye of a woman who had spent her life evaluating others, finding them wanting, and dismissing them without sentiment. "You are the seamstress who repaired Lady Cecily's gown the night of the ball." It was not a question, but Alara answered anyway. "Yes, Your Majesty. I am told your work is exceptional, that you have a gift." "I have had many years of practice, Your Majesty. Practice can be acquired by anyone. Gift cannot." The queen moved toward a table where a gown of deep blue velvet lay spread across the surface. "This was my grandmother's. It was to be worn by my daughter on her wedding day, but my daughter died in childhood, and the gown has remained in storage for 40 years. I wish to have it altered for other purposes. The fabric is fragile, the embroidery irreplaceable, and I have been told that you are the only seamstress in this castle capable of the work without destroying the garment in the process." Alara approached the table slowly, her eyes drawn to the gown despite her awareness that the prince was watching her every movement. The velvet was indeed ancient, its piles still rich but its edges worn thin in places. The embroidery, silver thread depicting winter roses and climbing ivy, was a masterwork of medieval craftsmanship, the kind of work that took years to complete and could never be replicated. "It is beautiful, Your Majesty." Alara let her fingers hover over the fabric without touching. "May I examine it more closely?" "That is why you are here." Alara spent the next several minutes studying the gown with the focused attention she brought to all her work. She noted the weak points in the seams, the places where the velvet had begun to separate from its lining, the embroidered sections that would require stabilization before any alteration could be attempted. Throughout her examination, she felt the prince's gaze upon her like sunlight through glass, warming and uncomfortable in equal measure. "Well," demanded the queen. "It can be done, Your Majesty, but it will require time and considerable care. The velvet must be reinforced from within, and the embroidered panels should be temporarily removed, preserved, and reattached once the structural work is complete. I would estimate 3 weeks of work, perhaps 4, to do it properly." "You have 2 weeks. The Council of Lords meets then, and I wish to wear it." Alara hesitated. "Your Majesty, The risk of damage increases significantly if the work is rushed. I did not ask for your concerns. I asked for your skills. The Queen's voice held the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. You will complete this work in 2 weeks. You will be given a private chamber near the royal quarters to work in, so that the gown need not travel unnecessarily. You will report your progress to me daily. Yes, Your Majesty. You may begin tomorrow. My son will show you to the chamber now. Alara's breath caught. She risked a glance toward the prince, found him already on his feet, his expression unreadable. This way, he said, and his voice was lower than she had imagined, like stones beneath running water. If you've been watching this story, leave a comment now with the phrase, "Some meetings are written in the stars." Let me know if you believe in fate, and let's see how many of us felt that spark when Alara and Alaric first truly saw each other. The chamber was small but well-appointed, with a large table positioned beneath a window that faced east for optimal morning light. A fireplace occupied one wall, already burning against the winter chill, and shelves lined another, empty and waiting for whatever tools Alara might require. Alara stood in the center of the room, acutely aware that the prince had not yet left. He remained in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space in a way that made her feel simultaneously trapped and protected. "This should serve your purposes," he said. "Yes, Your Highness. It is more than adequate." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Alara kept her eyes lowered, though she could feel his gaze upon her like a physical weight. "You are frightened of me." The statement surprised her enough to look up. His expression held something she could not decipher. Not cruelty, not amusement, but something closer to curiosity tinged with resignation. "I am a servant, Your Highness. Fear is part of my station. And if I told you not to be afraid, then I would obey, as is my duty. But the fear would remain." A ghost of something, almost a smile, passed across his face. "Honest. That is unusual. My mother taught me that lying requires remembering which falsehoods you have told to whom. The truth is simpler." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Alara realized her mistake immediately. The past tense, the revelation of loss, the inappropriate intimacy of sharing such information with royalty. "Forgive me, Your Highness. I should not—" What was her name? The question was soft, unexpected, and entirely wrong for a conversation between a prince and a seamstress. Alara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, felt the rules she had built her survival upon beginning to crack. "Helena," she heard herself say. "Helena Thorne. Helena." He repeated the name as though testing its weight. "And you are Alara." "Yes, Your Highness." "Alara." Again that testing, that weighing. "I looked for you after the ball, in the corridors, in the servants' hall, wherever I could reasonably justify my presence. You had vanished." Her heart was performing acrobatics now, dangerous leaps and turns that left her breathless. "I returned to my work, Your Highness. That is where I belonged." "Is it?" "Yes." She said it firmly, as much to convince herself as him. "I am a seamstress. My place is with needle and thread, not with princes in private chambers. And yet here you stand. By your mother's command, not by choice." Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of pain, quickly suppressed. "No, not by choice. None of us have that luxury, do we? You serve because you must. I rule because I was born to it. We are both prisoners of circumstance, Alara Thorne, wearing different chains." He stepped back then, as though recognizing that he had crossed some invisible boundary. His expression closed, the mask of royal composure settling back into place. "The servants will bring your meals here while you work. If you require anything, inform the page stationed at the end of the corridor. I will not disturb you again." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Alara alone with a fragile gown and a heart that would not stop racing. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was both torment and sanctuary. Alara worked on the queen's gown from dawn until the light failed, her fingers moving with precision born of years of practice. The velvet yielded to her careful ministrations, the ancient seams strengthening beneath her needle, the embroidered panels coming alive again under her restoration. It was good work, honest work. and she lost herself in it the way a swimmer loses herself in the sea. But the prince did not keep his promise to stay away. He came the third day, ostensibly to check on the gown's progress at his mother's request. He stood at a respectful distance while Alara explained her work, pointing to the sections she had reinforced, the panels she had stabilized. He asked questions that revealed a surprising understanding of craftsmanship, questions about thread weight and stitch patterns and the properties of different fabrics. "My grandmother taught me," he explained when she commented on his knowledge. "She believed that a ruler who did not understand how things were made could not truly understand the people who made them." He came again the 5th day and the 7th, and by the 9th day, Alara had stopped pretending she did not look forward to his visits. They talked of small things at first, the weather, the castle, the progress of her work, but gradually the conversations deepened, flowing into territories neither had intended to explore. He told her about Valdenhall, about the 5 years he had spent in diplomatic exile, about the loneliness that had hollowed him out until he felt like a walking ghost. She told him about her mother's death, about her brother Thomas and his dreams of scholarship, about the village where she had grown up and the life she had left behind. "Why did you come to the castle?" he asked one afternoon, the winter light painting silver streaks across the chamber floor. "Because there was nothing left in the village for me. My mother was gone, my father's forge had been sold to pay his debts, and Thomas needed more than I could provide on a healer's apprentice wages. Lady Ashworth's household was hiring, and I had skills that could be sold." She paused, her needle hovering over the velvet. "I have never regretted it. This work has given me purpose, has kept Thomas fed and schooled. But sometimes I wonder what it would have been like. To have choices, to wake in the morning and decide my own path rather than walking the one laid out for me by others." Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "I wonder the same thing. Every day." Their eyes met across the room, and in that meeting, Alara saw something she had never expected to find. Recognition, understanding, a mirror reflecting her own loneliness back at her, held in the hands of the most unlikely person imaginable. "We should not be doing this," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "We should not." But neither of them moved to end it. The crisis came on the 11th day, 2 days before the Council of Lords was set to convene. Alara was alone in the chamber, putting the final touches on the gown's bodice, when the door burst open without warning. Lady Ashworth stood in the entrance, her face a mask of cold fury, and behind her stood Lord Chancellor Westbrook, his expression grave. "So it is true," Lady Ashworth breathed. "The rumors, the whispers. I did not believe them, but here is the proof." Alara rose slowly, her heart hammering. "My lady, I do not understand. Do not play innocent with me, girl. The entire castle knows. The prince visits you daily. He spends hours in this chamber, alone with a servant, while his duty waits and his mother's patience thins." Lady Ashworth stepped forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Did you think no one would notice? Did you think you could seduce your way into a crown? I have seduced no one. Silence." The word cracked like a whip. "You forget your place. You are nothing, less than nothing, and you have endangered your position, your brother's future, and the stability of this household with your presumption." Lord Chancellor Westbrook cleared his throat. "The situation is delicate, but not irreparable. The seamstress will be dismissed immediately and returned to the village. The gown will be completed by another hand. The prince will be reminded of his obligations, and this incident will be forgotten." Alara felt the ground crumbling beneath her. Everything she had built, 6 years of careful work, of saving and planning, of ensuring Thomas's future, was dissolving like morning frost. "Please," she said, and hated the tremor in her voice. "I have done nothing wrong. The prince came to observe the work on his mother's gown. We spoke, yes, but only as—" "Only as what?" Lady Ashworth demanded. "As equals? As friends? You are a servant girl. Your only value lies in your usefulness, and you have made yourself worse than useless. You have become a liability. She has become nothing of the sort." The voice came from the doorway, and all three turned to find Crown Prince Alaric standing there, his expression colder than Alara had ever seen it. "Your Highness," Westbrook began, "this matter does not require your—" "This matter requires exactly my involvement, Lord Chancellor, as I am apparently the subject of it." Alaric stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made the others shrink back instinctively. "Alara Thorne has served this castle with distinction for 6 years. She has committed no crime, broken no law, violated no oath. She has simply done her work, and done it brilliantly, while I, of my own volition, chose to observe and converse. Your Highness, the impropriety is mine, not hers. If anyone is to be punished for these conversations, it should be me. But we both know that will not happen, because princes are not punished for speaking to servants. They are merely redirected." His voice carried a bitterness that cut through the air like a blade. "So let me be clear. Alara Thorne will not be dismissed. She will complete the gown as my mother commanded, and she will continue in her position for as long as she wishes to remain. Anyone who attempts to harm her, professionally or otherwise, will answer to me, directly." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Ashworth's face had gone pale. Westbrook's jaw worked soundlessly, and Alara stood frozen, caught between gratitude and terror, watching the prince defend her with a ferocity that felt like standing in the path of a storm. "Your Highness," Westbrook finally managed, "the king will hear of this. I expect he will. And when he does, he will hear my perspective as well." Alaric's gaze swept over them both with something approaching contempt. "Now leave, both of you. The seamstress has work to complete, and you have wasted enough of her time." They left. There was nothing else they could do. When the door closed behind them, Alaric turned to Alara, and the coldness in his expression melted into something far more vulnerable. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have been more careful. I should have protected you from this. You just did. Not soon enough. The damage is done. They will watch you now. Wait for any excuse to—" "I know." Alara heard the steadiness in her own voice and wondered where it came from. "I have always known the risks of being seen, but I do not regret it. These days, these conversations, they have meant more to me than I can say. Alara, please." She held up a hand, stopping him before he could say something that would shatter them both. "Let me finish the gown. Let me do the one thing I can do well, and then we will see what comes next." He looked at her for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes holding depths she was only beginning to understand. Then he nodded, slowly, and withdrew without another word. The gown was finished on the morning of the council, every stitch perfect, every seam reinforced, the ancient embroidery gleaming as though newly created. Alara delivered it to the queen's chambers herself, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that weighted her limbs. Queen Matilda examined the work in silence, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice held an edge that had not been there before. "You have done well. Better than well. This is extraordinary work. Thank you, Your Majesty. My son speaks highly of you. Too highly, some would say." The Queen's gaze locked onto Alara's face. "I know what happened with Lady Ashworth and Lord Westbrook. I know what my son said in your defense." Alara felt her heart stop. "Your Majesty, I never intended—" "Intentions are irrelevant. Actions are what matter. And my son's actions have made his regard for you quite public." The Queen set down the gown and moved closer, her presence overwhelming. "I am not a cruel woman, despite what the court whispers. I was young once. I remember what it was to feel the pull of connection, the impossible hope that the walls between stations might somehow be breached." She paused, and something almost like compassion flickered across her face. "But I am also a queen, and I have watched those walls crush people far stronger than you. My son's previous attachment nearly destroyed him. I will not allow that to happen again. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Do you care for him? Truly?" The question was so unexpected that Alara answered before she could think to lie. "Yes. More than I should. More than I have any right to." The Queen studied her for a long, measured moment. Then slowly she nodded. "Then you will understand why what happens next is necessary, For him, for the kingdom, and yes, for you, though you may not see it that way now." Before Alara could ask what she meant, the queen turned away. The conversation clearly ended. The Council of Lords convened that afternoon in the Great Hall, every noble family of significance represented around the massive oak table. Alara watched from the servants' passage, unable to stay away despite knowing the danger, as the queen entered wearing the restored gown, as King Edmund took his place at the head of the table, as Crown Prince Alaric stood at his father's right hand with an expression of careful blankness. The business of the kingdom proceeded. Taxes and treaties, land disputes and trade agreements. Alara understood little of it, but she watched Alaric throughout, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained clasped behind his back as though restraining themselves from reaching for something. Then Lord Westbrook rose to speak. "Your Majesty, there is one final matter to address. The question of His Highness's betrothal." The hall fell silent. Alaric's expression did not change, but Alara saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "The Crown Prince has been home for nearly a month," Westbrook continued. "It is time, past time, that a bride be selected to secure the succession. I propose that a decision be announced today before this council, so that preparations may begin immediately." King Edmund nodded slowly, his aged face weary. "My son, have you made a choice?" Every eye in the hall turned to Alaric. Alara pressed herself against the cold stone of the passage, her heart breaking with each beat. "I have," Alaric said, and his voice carried through the hall with crystalline clarity. "But it is not a choice that this council will approve." Murmurs rippled through the assembled lords. The king's brow furrowed. "Explain." "For 5 years I have done my duty. I have served in exile, negotiated treaties, smiled at foreign courts while my soul withered. I have been the prince this kingdom required, obedient, compliant, empty." Alaric's voice grew stronger with each word. "I returned expecting to continue that performance until death released me from it. But something changed. Someone changed me." He turned, and his eyes found the servants' passage, found the small figure pressed against the stone, found Alara with the unerring precision of a compass finding north. "I have fallen in love with a woman who has no title, no lands, no political value whatsoever. She is a seamstress, the daughter of a blacksmith and a healer, and she is the finest person I have ever known. She has more courage in her smallest finger than half this council possesses in their entire bodies, and she has shown me that feeling is not weakness, that connection is not a liability, that love, real love, is worth any price." The hall erupted. Lords shouted over one another, some in outrage, some in disbelief. Lady Ashworth had gone pale as parchment. Lord Westbrook looked as though he might collapse. But King Edmund raised a hand, and silence fell. "You speak of the seamstress," he said slowly, "the one who restored your mother's gown. Yes, you understand what you are asking, the scandal, the opposition, the potential instability. I understand all of it, and I ask anyway." Alaric's voice softened. "Father, you told me once that a king's greatest strength is knowing when to bend so that he does not break. I am telling you now, if you force me into a loveless marriage, I will break. I will become the empty shell I was in Valdenhall, and I will rule this kingdom with that emptiness until it poisons everything I touch. But if you allow me this, if you trust me to build something real with someone who sees me, truly sees me, I will be the king you always hoped I would become." The silence stretched into eternity. Then Queen Matilda rose from her seat, the blue velvet gown catching the light, and walked to stand beside her son. "I have spoken with the girl," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "She is not what I expected. She is not ambitious, not calculating, not the fortune hunter I assumed her to be. She is remarkable in ways that have nothing to do with birth or station." She turned to her husband. "Edmund, we have spent our lives building alliances, securing advantages, playing the game that kings and queens must play. But our son is asking for something we never dared to ask for ourselves. Perhaps it is time to build something different." The king looked at his wife, at his son, and finally, following their gazes, at the servants' passage where Alara stood trembling. "Bring her forward," he commanded. Alara walked through the great hall on legs that felt made of water, every eye upon her, every whisper cutting through the air like a blade. She kept her gaze fixed on Alaric, drew strength from his presence, from the love she saw shining in his face. She stopped before the king and curtsied so deeply her knees touched the cold stone floor. "Rise," King Edmund said. "Let me see you." She obeyed, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. The king studied her for a long moment. "My son claims to love you. Do you love him in return?" "Yes, your majesty." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it did not waver. "I love him with everything I am." "And you understand what this would mean? The life you would lead, the enemies you would face, the constant scrutiny and judgment?" "I understand, your majesty. I have lived my whole life being judged for things I cannot control. At least this time, I would face that judgment with someone who sees my worth." Something flickered in the old king's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You speak well for a seamstress." "My mother taught me that words are the only weapons the powerless possess, your majesty. I have learned to use them carefully." A ghost of a smile crossed the king's face. He turned to his son, then to his wife, and finally back to the assembled lords. "This council has advised me for 40 years, he said slowly. "You have guided this kingdom through wars and famines, through treaties and betrayals. I have valued your counsel above almost all things." He paused. "But there are some decisions that a king must make alone. Decisions of the heart. Decisions about legacy and love and what kind of world we leave behind." He rose from his seat, and despite his age, despite his failing health, he seemed in that moment every inch the ruler he had been in his prime. "I will not force my son into a marriage that will destroy him. I have seen what becomes of princes who rule without heart. They become tyrants or puppets or ghosts wearing crowns. My son has found someone who makes him more, not less, and I will not sacrifice that for political convenience." The hall erupted again, but the king spoke over the chaos. "The seamstress Alara Thorne will be elevated to the rank of lady. She will be educated in the ways of court, trained in the responsibilities she will bear. And when she is ready, when both she and my son are ready, they will be wed with my blessing." Alaric crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, taking Alara's hands in his own before the entire council, before God and kingdom, and everyone who had ever told either of them that this was impossible. "I told you," he said softly, for her ears alone. "You were never meant to be invisible." Spring had come to Aldoria, melting the winter snows and painting the hills in shades of green and gold. In the gardens of Ravensthorn Castle, cherry blossoms drifted on the warm breeze, their petals catching in the hair of the woman who walked among them. Alara paused beside the fountain, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, and watched as her husband approached. Alaric was smiling, truly smiling, with a warmth that had been absent from his face for years before she knew him, and the sight of it still made her heart flutter. "You should be resting," he said, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I've been resting all morning. Your mother insisted. My mother has become rather protective of her future grandchild. Your mother has become rather protective of me." Alara shook her head in wonder. "A year ago, she was ready to have me sent back to the village in disgrace. Now she spends half her time teaching me court protocol and the other half knitting tiny blankets. People change. Circumstances change them." Alaric drew her close, his arms wrapping around her with infinite gentleness. "I know this better than anyone." They stood together in the garden, the sun warming their faces, the future stretching before them like a road without end. It would not be easy. They both knew this. There were still lords who muttered about the impropriety, still ladies who whispered behind their fans, still challenges and obstacles and trials to come, but they would face them together. Thomas had arrived at the castle 3 months ago, his scholarship secured by royal decree, his future brighter than either sibling had ever dared to dream. He was studying with the kingdom's finest scholars, learning languages and histories and sciences that would have been forever beyond his reach. Sometimes Alara found him in the library late at night, surrounded by books, and she would remember their mother's words. "Knowledge is the one treasure that cannot be stolen." Their mother would have been proud of both of them. "What are you thinking?" Alaric asked, his voice soft against her hair. "I'm thinking about how strange life is, How I spent years trying to be invisible, trying to disappear into the background, believing that safety lay in being unseen. And then you looked at me, really looked, and everything changed. Do you regret it? Any of it? She turned in his arms, met his gray-blue eyes with her own, and smiled. Not for a single moment. He kissed her then. There in the garden among the cherry blossoms, with the castle rising behind them and the future unfolding before them. A prince and a seamstress, a crown and a needle, two people who had found each other across the vast divide of station and circumstance. Some stories end with happily ever after. But the truest stories are the ones that matter, end with something better. The beginning of a life built together, thread by thread, day by day, love by love. This is not an ending. It is a beginning. And so our story comes to its close. If you watched this far, it's because this tale touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who truly cherishes these stories. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because stories like Alara and Alarix are waiting to be discovered, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Leave a like if this story moved you, and share it with someone who believes that love can overcome any obstacle, that being truly seen is the greatest gift we can give another person. From wherever you are watching, from whatever city, whatever country, whatever corner of this world, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing in stories.